Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar, Microdynamics 5, Overcoming Weeds and Nurturing Crops with Stewart Lundy. It's a pleasure to have you all with us tonight. My name is Rafael Guzman. I work in education here with the Biodynamic Association. I'm a staff member, and I'm just going to go over a few things before we begin our session this evening. Number one, for sound quality for the recording, we do ask that aside from Stewart, we are muted unless we have a question to raise or something to share. This helps with the recorded quality as our session will be recorded and sent out to participants or participants who aren't able to make it tonight and shared that way. Let's see here. So there are a couple different ways you can jump in and share a question or connect with other participants, and one of them is by raising your hand. And let's see if I can walk us through that. So at the bottom bar of our screen, if you highlight it with your cursor, you'll find a bar pops up, and in that bar is a little silhouette that says participants. If you click on that, a little pop-out will come to your right, and at the bottom of that you can select an option to raise your hand, lower your hand, mute and unmute yourself, turn off your video, turn on your video, and there are also some options now for reactions, which is fun. So that's an option to raise your hand and I can call on you. A lot of the times in these sessions it's more of a popcorn style, so feel free to just unmute yourself if Stewart's asking for feedback, and we can dialogue from there. Another thing to highlight is that we have a chat feature, and that is again at the bottom of the screen. There's a little box that says chat. There has been some discussion in there already. There's an opportunity to just type in a question there and pose that either to someone directly or to the group as a whole as an open question as we go through our session this evening. For those of you, if anyone's joining by phone, the option to mute and unmute yourself is *6, and again *6 to mute yourself once more. Regarding video, you're welcome to have your video on. Sometimes it's a nice way to connect, especially in these times. If at all, however, you're having any interruption with your internet service or having jumpy audio, we do recommend that turning off your video gives more bandwidth to your audio so you're able to connect a little more readily. And that being said, I will just give a moment and see if there are any questions that arise around using Zoom. I'm not seeing any. All right, well, without further ado, I will turn it over to Stewart. Stewart, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Raphael. For those of you who perhaps don't know me yet, my name is Stewart Lundy. I work at Perennial Roots Farm in Accomack, Virginia, where we do a little bit of everything. We've got herbs, we have vegetables, we do a CSA, we have a bunch of different animals, we have an orchard, I make herbal remedies out of that, and of course on top of that we also practice biodynamics. As of this year, we had to shift entirely from a market-based model to a CSA, and we did that in about 2 weeks, all at once. Fortunately, we'd spent 10 years practicing how to grow plants and grow crops that we wanted. So I found that the biggest trouble that people have when they do a CSA or kind of a production model on a farm is having regular, consistent growth. And we got that down by going to 4 or 5 markets a week. So the CSA transition has actually worked really well for us. But this is going to be about a lot of what we've learned over our time here. It's not all the solutions. They may not even be the perfect solutions, but they're ones that we're working with now and that we've seen a lot of benefit from. So one concept we have to think about is what fertilizing means in the farm. And that may seem like an odd thing to talk about first, but within biodynamics, the idea of fertilization is really to enliven and enrich the soil. And this means that weeds will and even should want to grow in your garden, because they have just as much of a right to grow as anything else. And that's really important for us to understand, because that will also help us understand how then to manage these weeds. If we don't first think about it in terms of a fertility issue, then it's going to be confounding. It'll seem like invasive species coming into our garden, or plants growing simply where we don't want them. But that doesn't get us very far, as Steiner will further indicate. Now, since you're watching this webinar, I'm going to assume that you have more of a regenerative approach to gardening, and probably means that you've discarded harsher herbicides, and which will mean that you will have more weeds. But that's okay. Our own farm, I think, is a pretty nice farm, but we've had positive articles written about us by local journalists who ended up saying that we have a messy farm or a weedy farm. And it has to be written from a draconian homeowners association aesthetic, because within our garden, we don't have a lot of weeds. Now, through the orchard and out in the field, I think a lot of these weeds are actually doing a lot of good. And as long as they're not taking over the garden, I'll even let some of them stay. If you talk to anyone who's worked on our farm, whether an apprentice or intern, they'll say that if they ask Natalie what to do in terms of weeding, Natalie will probably say that we remove all of the weeds. If they ask me and get the right answer, I'll tell them to leave that beautiful dock plant, or that luxuriant chicory, to let it grow tall, or that patch of yarrow, just mow around that. And for me, I like to see some weeds spotted through the garden, and I don't consider them to be a threat. As long as they're not taking over, I really think it's a good thing to keep those. Natalie's very forgiving when it comes to weeds, as long as they're outside the garden. When they're inside the garden, yeah, she doesn't really want to see them there, and I completely understand that. So I'm going to start here with a quote from Rudolf Steiner that will help us begin this conversation about weed management. Rudolf Steiner says in the agriculture course, "Weeds have just as much right to grow in nature's forum as any plants you might happen to find useful." And this is really the basis of how are we going to manage our garden. We must, on the one hand, add fertility, which, at least in Steiner's mind, has to do with moon forces. These things that are wet, soluble, things like humus, compost, manure, even something like sea salt and rainwater. Anything you think about with irrigation that will lead to etheric growth, all of those things, weeds like them just as much as your plants do. And most of our plants are, in a way, themselves domesticated weeds. So it's really our task to try to funnel that ethericity to the plants we want. And it's a delicate balancing act. You could really look at everything in farming as trying to balance these polarities. In Steiner's talk, he would use two unusual terms, at least to people unfamiliar with biodynamics or anthroposophy. He talks about moon forces and Saturn forces. And this can be a little confusing, but I'll try to simplify it here so that we can work with Steiner's terms. And if you ever want to go back and look at his other works, this will shed some light. Moon forces have to do with what is watery and what is earthy. Saturn, on the other hand, with what is airy and warm, which, if you want to simplify this, you could really say moon forces have to do with yin activities and Saturn forces with yang. That makes it a lot easier for anyone who has that idea of yin-yang to engage this idea. So moon is really more of the feminine earthly side. You can call Saturn, if you need to, the masculine airy heavenly side. And it's always about balancing these. Something you might call a heavy feeder actually needs more moon forces. It needs more humus, it needs more compost, it needs more manure, possibly even more watering. Whereas something that you want to produce, like essential oils, you actually want to expose them to more of the heat and light and warm air in order to get them to produce those oils. And it's always balancing these two. In Steiner's lectures, it can be confusing because sometimes he says moon, and he means moon as one celestial body among many. Other times he uses it as a sort of shorthand to mean the moon and the inner planets. And likewise with Saturn. Sometimes he means Saturn as one of 7 planets, and other times he means it as the outer planets. And for our purposes, we can really think of them almost as yin and yang, as the warm air above the soil and as the wet, earthy elements below. We can think of those in a way as Moon and Saturn. We could get into much more specificity on this, but for our purposes today, I don't want to delve into the minutia of this, unless that's where the conversation goes. Here's a quote from Steiner in Man as Symphony of the Creative Word, and he says, "Even today, there is still a kind of sharp contrast between what is above and what is of the nature of Saturn, and what is below, what is the nature of the earth, moon, and watery condition. Thus, we can quite well differentiate between the Saturn-Sun gaseous element and the Moon-Earth fluidic element. If you have something like a fungal problem on a plant, you're probably having an excess of these moon forces, either because it was a wet winter followed by a wet spring, or it's just been really, really humid and you're having water condense on the leaves of your plants. They can't dry out and fungus grows there, almost as if the leaves themselves have become a second kind of soil where fungus normally might want to grow under the ground, because it has those kind of greenhouse conditions of just dampness. So we're always trying to balance this as a farmer. If the soil is too dry, we bring water. If it's too wet, we cultivate it to try to open it up and allow that to exhale. But we're always balancing these two polarities, whether you call it Moon and Saturn or yin and yang. But in order to really engage weeds, this is how we think. This is how we have to engage a new kind of farming on a new level. I'm going to jump right into tools that I like to use for cultivation. This first one is a beauty. This is by PKS Bronze, which is Pythagoras Kepler Systems, which is, I believe it's Victor Schauberger's grandson. It's at least a descendant. But Victor Schauberger liked to use bronze tools as opposed to steel or iron-based tools. And he had this idea that iron builds up in the soil every year that we use a steel or copper tool. Steel tool. Copper, on the other hand, washes out every year. So when you have rain, you lose copper. Whereas if you're using steel, every year you get a little bit more iron, and that leads to an iron imbalance. Copper and iron should be, in balance. The way that, sun and moon should be in balance, or sun and Saturn should be in balance. Now, Schauberger's idea was to go back in time, almost to retreat to the Bronze Age. Steiner was sensitive to the same iron excesses and even mentions iron excesses in the agriculture course, but his solution to this technological development of steel tractor implements was not another technological advance, nor was it a technological retreat. Steiner had a much more sensitive imagination and then brought forth instead a plant. He championed the idea of planting stinging nettles around your garden in order that they might mitigate these iron excesses through their radiant forces. And his idea to a technological problem was a plant, which I think is really remarkable, because most of his recommendations for biodynamics is to remain within the realm of the living. So his answer to steel implements and iron excesses building up over time is more stinging nettles. So we don't have to avoid steel, and we don't have to buy bronze implements, which are, after all, much more expensive. We can use steel as long as we also use stinging nettles. For Victor Schauberger, one of the reasons you don't want iron excesses is you'll end up with much more of, in terms of like slug problems, because they like that. If on the other hand you're using copper, the slugs aren't as interested. Slugs actually have a copper-based blood as opposed to humans. So their blood is actually closer to blue, a bit like those horseshoe crabs. They have a blue blood based on copper. We have a red blood based on iron. And when you use something like copper or bronze hoe, the slugs don't like that. Whereas if you use steel, they seem to like that because they have to keep re-ingesting iron. Now, if you're using nettles, either as a preparation, spraying on your plants, using it in your compost pile, or even as a periphery around your garden, the radiant effect will help against these slug problems. Now, nettles itself can become a weed, so you have to control it. Either that means you cut it down before it's gone to seed and you make a preparation with it, or you make teas with it, but you have to manage it as well. Just don't allow it to become that weed. And even if it became a weed, we'll get to it later, but you can make a pepper out of it in order to scatter that through your garden and inhibit the growth of the beneficial herb that you have around the periphery. We'll get to that later. In biodynamics, that's called a pepper, but it's in this slideshow, so don't worry about it. We will discuss that. So these are two hoes that we really like. These are from Johnny Select Seeds. I don't remember the exact dimensions, but I think the small one on the right is 2.5 inches, and the one on the left is roughly twice that. I prefer the smaller hoe because what that allows is for you to push all of your effort into a smaller space, which means less resistance and also means less work, and you can be more precise with the smaller one. You may have the instinct that the bigger one means, oh, you'll get more done all at once. Yeah, if you have a lot of upper body strength, you can work the bigger one with ease. But ultimately, the smaller one requires so much less effort that I use that almost exclusively. And there are all sorts of tools. Like there's this kind of hoe, that kind of hoe. You'll find dozens of them. This one's called a scuffle hoe or a shuffle hoe. It also has multiple names. But I like this one because it has an easy back and forth action that cuts whether you're pushing or pulling. Now, over the years, we've tried all sorts of hoes, and this is the one we've settled as our favorite. It doesn't mean that it's the best, and you might find another is more comfortable, and that's fine. I'm just speaking from our experience, and this is one that we really favor. Steiner was once asked which spiritual practice was most important, and he replied, whichever one you actually do. So he offered dozens of meditations and said, whichever one you do, just do one. And that's true with the hoe. This is just the one I like, and if you're able to use it and benefit from our experience, that's great. So the moon. Steiner talks about moon forces, and you will notice this in any plant where you see prolific reproduction. This will mean many seeds or many viable seeds, and it spreads. If you have a plant that can reproduce from other parts, that is also moon forces. Some plants reproduce by rhizome, some even from a bit of the stem, some from part of the leaf even. All of that is moon forces. And Steiner says here, again from the agriculture course, even though among them we often see the very strongest medicinal plants, the moon forces have the greatest influence in the plants we tend to label as weeds. Now, weeds and even herb, they mean the same thing. These are medicinal plants, and it's not a mistake that Rudolf Steiner selected herbs that were wild, and you could find almost everywhere in the part of Europe where he delivered these, near Koperwitz, which is now in part of what we now call Poland. And most of these weeds actually occur on every inhabited continent, and that's pretty remarkable too. Now, if anyone's getting into biodynamics and wants to start using herbs, Steiner, in the original German, he does say that each of these herbs can be replaced. And he says that repeatedly, and he says it for every single one. He only says he can't imagine a suitable replacement for stinging nettles, which is almost certainly true for inside Europe where he was talking. But there are many other Urtica varieties which are used in indigenous medicine for a blood builder. So you would look for ones that have comparable medicinal uses, and there are absolutely suitable substitutes. Someone's asking, how do you stop your tools from rusting? That's a good question. I use them a lot, and that stops them from rusting. Anytime you use them, it shaves it off, and it keeps them sharp as well. Sometimes with the steel, you may have to file or hammer Traditionally, people used to do what's called peening. They would hammer the tip in order to form a sharp edge. And that was back when steel was really expensive, so they valued it and they needed to keep it as like a family heirloom. The nice thing about the bronze PKS tools is that copper bronze tools are actually self-sharpening because it is a relatively soft metal. The irony is that then causes it to sharpen every time you use it. So PKS bronze is very nice in that sense. It's easier to push bronze tools through the soil because they don't have the same ferromagnetic resistance as when you push steel through. So if you're looking for lighter work, the bronze does still have some benefits. Anthony's asking about if I've ever tried the Russian flat tool, a permaculture tool, and my answer is no. I'm not familiar with the tool, nor have I used that. If anyone else has or has something they want to add to the chat, feel free. And I'm going to continue to our next slide, if that's all right. So Steiner has an odd drawing in the agriculture course where he shows 3 lines moving down and then coming up through the soil, and then shows this strange little addition in yellow growing above it, and then there are these red dots. And I've tried to tease that out for our understanding here so we can see better what he's talking about. The so-called inner planets, which is the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the ones closest to us, those are represented by the Moon. And because it is the closest, just like Saturn is the furthest, therefore it represents the outer planets. But if we look at this, Steiner shows 3. He doesn't show the planets, but this is what I believe he means. He shows these 3 as they move into the soil and then must come up again. And that may sound a little abstract, but the inner planets, some have to go into the ground and then rise. But it doesn't if you think of it in terms of compost, in terms of manure, in terms of rainwater. It doesn't do plants a lot of good if rain just falls on their leaves. It has to go into the ground where then the plants can absorb it. Likewise with compost. If you just bury a plant, unless it's something like potatoes, it doesn't do it a lot of good. You want it in the soil where the root can interact with it. That's true to a manure or cover crops. You want it turned into the soil so the plant can use it. So for me, this is what these inner planet forces mean, and they can even be the residue of last year's crops. All of those converted and then digested into the soil, which must then rise up again to the plant. This is that fertilization process that leads to abundant growth, but will also lead to weed growth, because we want luxurious vegetables. We want nutrient-dense food. We want brilliantly colored herbs in our garden. But if we do that, we're also giving the same resources to the weeds. We just have to choose and strategize on how to make that go mostly to our plants, less to these other weeds. Like, you can do foliar feeding on plants, of course, and but if you do that, you have to do it in a fine dilution. It's very easy to burn plants if you're using something like fish and you don't dilute it enough, or something like sea salts and you don't dilute it enough. And that's why it's much easier to put it into the ground and allow the plants to pick and choose as they see fit. This, as you can see, is a process of ripening. This process of ripening doesn't happen unless plants are exposed to warmth and to light. We can think of this in terms of photosynthesis, in terms of sugars, but even if you have light, but you don't have warmth, your tomatoes are just going to sit there. As you'll see, if you have, an unseasonably cool late summer, they'll just sit there green, waiting. This process, Steiner actually calls Saturn. This is important. So here's a quote again. Under the influence of the continuous stream from the outer planets to the plant, the fruit expands, fattening and rounding out. What we remove to eat as the apple or the peach comes from the effects of the distant planets, which is to say, warm air. Steiner, in Manna's Symphony of the Creative Word, defines sun working in concert with Saturn as warm air. Again, it's that yang side. So you can see why we get so many fruits coming out of summer and in the fall, because that warm air has been beating down all summer, and then we get the harvest. When we have this ripening and nourishing, we're witnessing the influence of the sun together with Saturn, which is to say the sun together with this warm air. And that's where we get sweetened apples and pears and peaches. The sun by itself, without this this warm air, is going to produce greenery, but it may not be something suitable for nourishment for human beings. You may get greens and leafy greens, but you're not going to get much in terms of caloric value that will really feed the limbs and give you energy to go do things. There's another sketch Steiner makes of Saturn influencing the Earth from above and then from below, and I've expanded this again here. If we keep in mind that Steiner defines the sun working in concert with Saturn as warm air, we can then understand how easily that can have an effect from above, but also from below. I've diagrammed this here just so that you can see it almost as a radiant process. I'm representing it as Saturn radiating down to Earth, and then conversely, it can happen from the other side. This is true of how water warms up over the seasons and how it's cold in spring because it's still cold from winter. But then by the time you get to fall, you have the warmest because there's that lag because of this thermal mass. And Saturn, or the sun's effect with Saturn together within the Earth realm, is witnessed by us as warm air. This doesn't just happen as it's coming down, it also warms the soil. We know that when we're thinking about planting in spring, the soil has to warm up. That is also a Saturn activity. That residual warmth is Saturn at work. I'll make it a little more clear by putting Saturn here. It can radiate directly down into the soil, and then the soil, having received that, also is warmed up and can radiate back outwards. And this is where Steiner says that the inner planets, which are typified by the moon, those yin things, the kind of watery, earthy things, must go down into the soil and then come up for there to be much benefit for plants. He says about Saturn that it has a direct radiating effect, just the warm air and light of the sun in summer, but it can also work up through the soil. So Saturn is Saturn wherever it occurs. Warm air is warm air wherever it occurs. So it can happen from both directions, whereas the moon forces in particular need that detour through the soil. So when we remember this image of the moon forces moving down to the soil and coming up, this is the rainwater, your humus, the manure, anything you've added to the soil to enrich it, it then needs to be irradiated by warm air and light from the outer planet influences. And if it doesn't have that, and you have a deficiency of these outer planets, you're going to end up with fungus or fire blight, these things attacking the plant, which is really just a lack of moving air, light, and warmth. So we're really balancing all of these elements. Let's see. Steiner shows these two dots appearing, and I'm going to show them actually developing. These dots are the ripening forces of Saturn that produce fruit, the sweetness that we're actually able to eat. These have to play together. This is really important. You don't get a good fruit out of just like bombarding a desert. No, you need the etheric to be growing and then to be influenced by the astral. The two have to play together, or you do not get these creative formative forces, which are actually nourishment for us. The etheric left by itself is a quagmire, which is not productive for food. And then Saturn by itself would produce a desert. You need the watery playing with the airy, you need the earthy and the fire all intermingled. It's this grand wedding between heaven and earth in the garden. And without that, there is no fertility. And here's some persimmons. This is an interesting one because they get better the longer you leave them. So there are always exceptions to this. Like Steiner actually talks about here that why we cook food is to make it more fruit-like. And that's it's a fascinating concept. But here, I'll read it directly for you. But cast an eye up to the plums and apples, at the fruits growing on trees. Ah, those we don't have to bother to cook much, for they've been cooked by the sun itself during the whole summer. And this is from Rudolf Steiner's collection of essays, now titled From Sunspots to Strawberries. These were the lectures given to the workmen. I think this is a fascinating idea, but then puts into perspective why we cook at all. For Steiner, really, the ideal diet is fruitarian, and that's why we don't need to cook most fruits. We steam leaves, but we cook thoroughly the roots so that they're more digestible. The root has sat buried in the soil, hidden from the sun. Even if it's sweetened somewhat, it needs to be ripened further. In some ways, this is a sweet potato that you leave out. And as the starches break down, it becomes sweeter. You could also cook it. Similarly, there are some exceptions, like quinces haven't fully ripened. They need to be cooked. Or medlars, which need to be harvested and then allowed to what's called blet, so they soften. But there are these multiple different ways of bringing food more towards this fruit stage, and that is when we eat them. Now, if you place a rock on the soil, and I'm sure everyone's picked up a rock or something similar, even a piece of wood, and looked underneath it, it's much cooler, it's darker, there's all sorts of life there, but you're probably not going to be seeing a lot of germination activity because that rock or that shade has kept it cool. And in that sense, you need the moon together with Saturn in order to stimulate germination, which is to say, you need yin and yang together. If you don't have the two together and you just have moon, things will often just sit there waiting for either light to stimulate germination or warmth. It needs one of those, if not both of those. As you can see, this Saturn color is radiating down and hits the rock. The rock warms as much as it can, but it also radiates, and that doesn't penetrate underneath that rock. Below the rock, it stays much darker, much cooler, and the moon forces are retained there. Because without moisture and warmth, you're not going to see germination. That's just what's going to happen. This is going to lead into one of the most practical ways I've found in terms of managing weeds on our farm. And there's some confusion around the concept, but I'm going to explain it. It's nothing that anyone needs to worry about, but this is what we use. We now use silage tarps. And this is really important because this is occultation. This is not solarization. I'm not sterilizing the soil. I'm not suffocating the soil. All that I'm doing is covering the soil, which allows the moon forces and water to stay in the soil and allows the warmth, the Saturn warmth, to radiate into the soil. The result is all of the weeds in that bed that you see covered will germinate, but then because they're deprived of the sun, occultation, we've eclipsed the sun, they die. So one of the most important things when prepping an area like this is to water it thoroughly. If you cover an area that isn't moist, all you're doing is adding Saturn to Saturn. You're just adding more yang to something that's already dried out. That's not going to do you any good at all. If at that point you are going to sterilize it, and that's not going to be good for you. We must add Saturn to Moon in order to stimulate the germination of weeds. I actually like to cultivate the bed thoroughly before tarping it. So I will broad fork it, add compost, add manure, add sea salt, biochar, whatever I'm going to add, water it thoroughly after cultivating to mix it all together. And then I tarp it. The reason for that is that without that water and without all of that, you're not going to stimulate the weed seeds. I want to stimulate them all to grow and then for them to perish without the sun. That is the whole idea of using this tarp. You can cause damage with a tarp like this if you leave it on too long. And Steiner was actually asked about this in the agriculture course, about whether covering a section of the garden would be bad. And he said, no, it would cause no harm as long as it's not left there for too long, which is absolutely true. A tarp like this is best used in spring and then in fall. If you're using it in the high season or when it's consistently warm, like if you're closer to the tropics, you would just leave it for a shorter period of time. That's it. This might be left for 2 or 3 weeks in the cooler season. It might only be left for 1 week in the warm season. So you have to think about the workings of these planetary processes within the Earth as they manifest here. And this is one of the best ways you can find. The yang effects are going to be more pronounced in summer. They're going to be more pronounced in the tropics. So you would leave it on for a shorter period of time because you don't want the Saturn forces, the yang forces, to overwhelm the moon forces that you put in the soil. The reason I add my fertilization methods first is that I want the seeds from the weeds to try to germinate, and then they die, and I'm left with what's called a stale seed bed, which gives me weeks of advance head start for all of my crops, and it's really wonderful. Sometimes I combine this with what you'll see here. This is my apprentice Austin, and he has a flame weeder. We are simultaneously I'm power harrowing, which is a form of vertical tillage instead of horizontal. Most people use a tiller that goes like this and inverts layers. And whereas what I'm using for the power harrow goes like this, and it prevents the inversion of layers, which keeps the laminations of the soil intact, the soil layers where they belong, also doesn't flip the seed bed and stimulate more weeds than I want to see. Austin going through and scorching the grass that's there teaches that he's not actually putting a lot of energy into that. He's just singeing it. What that does is send the plant into a kind of panic mode. Then once it's turned under, there's no light, it's trying to photosynthesize, and it dies a lot faster. If you simply bury something like grass, it can take a lot longer. Someone's asking if you can use something other than plastic for sheet mulch. In this case, yeah, you can. You can use canvas. I would just look to see how that's treated. In this case, these are UV stabilized tarps that I've actually been able to use some of them for probably over 5 years now. So they've lasted a long time. Yeah, I tear them and then I patch them up, and I'm able to keep using them. I'm not a fan of single-use plastic in any case. So this is something, if I have plastic at all on the farm, it needs to be something I can use and reuse and reuse. But that's a good question. As we continue, you can see here, this is what it looks like after cultivating. You're going to see grasses, and but that's okay. The tarp then comes over it, and then we smother it. For me, this is how a silage tarp works. It provides a layer of shade while allowing all the warmth, almost all the warmth of the sun to get into the soil. So you really you're reuniting yin and yang, Saturn and moon, but depriving it of sun so it actually can't grow. So you're providing the forces of fertility, but stopping it from being able to green up. That's really the important part here. So you have the forces of the sun, this light that's not allowed to enter. But Saturn, that pink, is allowed to get down into the soil, and then Saturn is able to play with moon, and the two together causes all of this germination. Yet, without the sun's light, they must perish. When you pull the tarp back a few weeks later, almost all of the debris will have been digested, particularly if you've used good compost, biodynamic preparations to stimulate this. I tend to use all of that. You'll see almost all the debris converted by earthworms into castings and just totally digested. They're initially, if you peek the first week, you're going to see, hopefully, nothing but weeds as far as the eye can see under the tarp. But once you leave it covered for a couple weeks, they can't live without that light. And that's what we're after. Once you pull it back, though, it's as if it's the first day of spring for that bed, and it's wonderful. You can actually extend the beginning of spring and just roll back one bed at a time as you're able to plant, and then prepare a new bed and tarp it. Right now is not a great time to do this, at least where we are, because we've been in the middle of a drought. It's already too much Saturn baking the soil. The warm air has thoroughly penetrated the soil. We need water right now. We actually did a sequential spray after Hugh Courtney's indications this week, and we got a huge thunderstorm. We just also got golf ball sized hail. So I don't know if we overdid it or if it's just a massive coincidence, but we're glad for the rain. Hail, I don't know. I collected some of it to see what I could do with it, but that's another story. If you solarize, a very different thing happens. Solarization allows not only Saturn, that warmth, to enter the soil, but allows the light to enter the soil. And that UV, combined with that heat left for any extended period of time, is going to destroy that soil, sterilize the soil, and ruin it. Sometimes people have to do this because they have some sort of pathogen that they feel like they need to eradicate. My problem with something like solarization, which uses clear plastic, is that you're starting over. You're turning living soil into dead dirt, and you don't want to do that, at least unless you can avoid it. The one case I can think of using solarization effectively would be because you're worried about a particular seed, a particular weed that requires sunlight for germination. In that case, I would avoid the clear plastic and don't solarize, but instead cultivate your beds, prep them, and then water them thoroughly until you see the whole bed full of these little baby plants. And then, just as they've germinated and poked their heads up, pull that silage tarp over them and smother them. And then you will have a relatively weed-free bed to begin your season. These methods really can't be underestimated. This is something we struggled with early, but we started with, when we got here, it was conventional no-till, and the only thing that would grow was weeds. We had horseweed, which was probably 7 feet tall. It was gigantic. And we were having to weed most of it by hand, and that was just a lot of work. Someone's asking whether flame weeder can spoil beneficial microbes. Then my answer is no, because you move by so quickly, you don't dwell on the soil. I mean, it's like a creme brulee torch. You just go, shh, and that's it. You're not trying to burn anything. You shouldn't see, like you only saw smoke in that previous slide, which I'll pull back up, because there's actually dry debris there. You're just going by and just going singe, singe, singe. And what that causes is this darkening of the leaves, which if you leave them out in the full sun, the roots try to send emergency resources up, but now that the leaves are scorched, they can't photosynthesize. If you burn the plant, like actually burn it, it can actually regenerate the plants. So you don't want to do that. You just want to singe. That singeing leaves the leaves intact but broken, and the plants will send all their resources up to the leaves, but photosynthesis can't happen, and then the plant basically starves itself trying to photosynthesize. But yeah, if you overscorch, of course you could ruin it, but you're just taking it, just singeing the top. Again, it's like creme brulee. So when you pull back the tarp, you have your relatively weed-free bed. You need to keep this watered the same way you needed to water the bed before you tarped it, because you need that constant supply of moon force. Now, if you have consistent rainfall, you don't need to worry about it. If you have a heavy clay, you probably don't need to think about it the same way, but it needs to be a dynamic relationship to this plant that it needs a constant supply of water, whether it's from this last winter, from a snowpack, from spring rains, or from your own irrigation. But you're going to be the one who has to balance that, the moon with Saturn. And you'll have to adapt that to your own place. So if it doesn't look different in each place, for me, it's maybe not biodynamics. So for me, you need to keep this watered, or at least make sure that it's supplied with enough water until it's able to shade its own roots. This is a really important principle, because just like those weeds we mentioned earlier that often require that light to germinate, if you can keep the plant watered until it shades its roots, once it's shaded its own roots, the weeds will have a much harder time germinating there. So that means you must be watering, but then because you will be stimulating weed seeds to germinate, you must be hoeing. This is where you need to be delicate. A lot of people hoe much too deep. What you really want to do is just shave. You don't want to gouge your face when you shave a beard. You don't want to gouge the soil when you're hoeing. It's this exact same principle, just the surface where you just clip the roots of those little baby seeds, and no more. Like deep cultivation will actually just stir up more weed seeds. You know, you don't really want to do that. So just think of it when you're hoeing as you're just shaving the surface. And it's best actually to hoe before you see weeds. And certainly if you can see any, even just little poking bits, it's much easier to kill a seed, a weed, when it is just germinating than once it's gotten its root anchored. I like to hoe actually in the morning, provided that the beds aren't too dry already. I like to hoe in the morning because this will actually turn all of the little weed seeds up on the ground, expose their roots, and they'll die in the midday sun, which for them is like experiencing midsummer, and they hate that. And then they'll perish. Yeah, the next slide here I'm going to show you is an example of a bed that was untarped. How many weeks ago was it? It was 6 weeks ago, I believe. Yeah, this one was 6 weeks ago. This is where we put our squash after having untarped it, transplanted directly into it without disturbing the soil further, because I don't want more weed seeds. And this is what's happened after 6 weeks. To me, that's okay. Then we come through with a hoe, and within 1 hour, all of the squash is hoed. All the weeds are handled. And we don't even hoe once a week on 2 acres because of how we've finally gotten this rhythm down. And that's a real trick here, is to be able to manage it and hoe correctly. If you hoe deeply, you're going to get more weeds. So again, it's just skimming the surface and making sure that a crust doesn't form on the top, because you don't want that either. In my consulting work, most farms I visited seem to be growing weeds, not crops, and their interns seem to be spending all of their time pulling weeds, and I feel bad for their interns. We try to provide internships and apprentices that they're relatively unskilled in weeding. They know how to use a hoe though, but ideally they're unpracticed at hand pulling weeds. There are some that you must hand pull, particularly noxious ones, and I'll talk about that a little later. But you shouldn't have to hoe very often, especially if you keep up with it and keep up with it early. This next slide is one of some little corn circles that we put together earlier this season. And I think this was untarped when this photo was taken 3 weeks. This is 3 weeks in the amount of weeds that have grown in 3 weeks. And this is with watering it a couple times a week, like thoroughly watering it. And you can see very little has come up because of that process of watering it and cultivating it and covering it with that tarp. Then I just come through and just skim, and it's such light work, because it really is. It's like taking a straight razor and just shaving, and then you're done. Ideally, that's how we've set this up, where we're able to balance Moon and Saturn with minimal effort. As you can see, if you can see this level of weeds in your garden, it's already time to hoe. For some things, it'll be hard to tell where to hoe, like carrots. But if you put something like radishes in the same row of carrots, those will pop up first, and you'll have a bead on exactly where those are, and you can hoe between them. There are many ways to manage this. So this can get a lot more involved, and at this point I'd like to open up for questions, because we're already actually halfway through, but there's a lot of rabbit holes we could go down here. So please, anyone who has questions, now would be an excellent time to chime in. I don't have the capacity to tell if someone's raising their hand or not, but yeah.
Looks like we have a question in the chat from Sue. Moon is in opposition to Saturn as a calendar operation time?
Yes, the question about that as a calendar. The time where, so I'm going to explain this for anybody who might not know. Opposition is when two planets are, relative to our vantage point on Earth, opposite each other. So let's say my head is the Earth, here is Saturn, Here's moon. When you could draw a straight line between them and my head, that's opposition. This happens roughly once a month whenever you see a full moon. The moon is opposite the sun, and that's what makes the moon a full moon. When you get a new moon, that's conjunction. They're over kind of on the same side, and that's why we can't see the bright side of the moon. There are a couple reasons for why moon opposite Saturn is considered beneficial. It's for all of these ideas that we have to balance the inner planets with the outer planets. That the inner moon forces with the Saturn forces the closest celestial body, the moon, with the furthest, at least in classical astrology, Saturn. And that's why those two can be balanced. Likewise, you could also think in terms of the smallest celestial body, the moon, relative to our perspective, and then Jupiter, which is the largest. So that's a kind of a secondary point. A lot of people consider that to be a really opportune moment of balance, particularly in New Zealand. I haven't seen a lot of data that ends up corroborating that, but as an idea, it does make sense. Linda is asking, any ideas for controlling equisetum? Well, this is where we get into the idea of for equisetum, you would have to collect spores if you wanted to burn the correct part. But for any weed, you really want to look at it in terms of finding its reproductive part. Wherever that reproductive process is most active. For most things, it's going to be in a seed. But for, if you live in North America like me, figs are not producing seeds because we don't have the proper wasp, the fig wasp. It doesn't live here. So the way they can be reproduced is asexually by cloning. Things like that can be split from their roots or reproduced by rhizomes. You can also collect the rhizomes and burn those carefully. And yeah, that's going to be one of your main approaches to dealing with something like that. And that's actually going to be something I'm going to talk about next. But yeah, if you are able to, this is the nice thing. The weeds that are actually the most problematic are actually going to be the ones that you must dig up by hand. That's usually going to be a part that is full of those reproductive forces. That's why you're digging it up like that. If you could just smother it and kill it, you wouldn't have to think about it. But the ones that you must go and dig up by hand, that right there is already biodynamic treasure, because that contains the forces of reproduction. If you take those rhizomes and burn those carefully so that you can collect all of that ash, you can scatter that through your garden. You can use it almost as a magic circle around the periphery, or you can scatter it through between your rows of lettuce in order to inhibit the reproduction there. But this is something that is specific to each kind of plant. So you can use it against domesticated radish, and that would be targeting that kind of radish, whereas you could use a wild radish seed, and that would target wild radishes, which are often far more aggressive, clearly demonstrating much more in terms of these moon forces. You need to take care that the part of the plant that you're burning isn't just old seeds. You want viable seeds. You want viable rhizomes. These are the ones you want to burn in order to collect. And someone actually sent me some questions about how to deal with this and how to do peppering in the right way. If we have some more questions, the next section is going to be dealing with how to deal with peppers, particularly when it comes to weeding, because that is a very important step, but in some ways a very important last step. So anybody else who has a question here about the tarping process, how to manage these weeds, and how to think of balancing the moon and Saturn, yin and yang, this is a place I'd really love some feedback. I see thinking faces and not many questions yet.
Feel free to also unmute yourselves and jump in.
Okay, hi Stuart. That's probably quicker than typing.
Yeah.
If you're using like a living mulch, like a straw or something as a mulch to protect your soils, in, maybe over garlic or amongst vegetables. And then you're kind of increasing the risk of slug damage and things like that. Any ideas with that kind of mulching, please?
If you're having slugs show up, slugs they're really a strange creature. They always have to be blanketed in moisture, but not moisture that they produce. Yet they're able to move through dry areas temporarily. It's almost like a fish that can move between ponds. The problem with mulching heavily with something like straw or leaf mulch is that it's going to bring a lot of these moon forces that are great in terms of cooling and shading and keeping moisture there. The problem is that's exactly what they do, and the slugs love that. So I actually, this year, we used some wood chips, enough to just kind of cool the soil a bit for our garlic, but not enough that it's providing habitat for slugs. If that makes sense. You may need to mulch shallowly or mulch more regularly and shallowly, so that it doesn't become a sticky, slimy habitat for slugs, if that makes sense. Because once that stuff compresses, those layers, and it becomes suffocated, the slugs really adore that stuff. I hope that helps. Liz is asking, when I put equisetum on leaves that have mildew, then the equisetum is bringing in the Saturn forces, right? Absolutely. If you would look at Saturn as this kind of raying figure, if you don't have equisetum, there are alternatives. And I can't remember the name right now, but in Australia, there's a tree that they use instead of equisetum arvens, which has a similar silicic acid content. And they have it in a document. Can't pull it up.
It is Casuarina equisetifolia.
There you go. Thank you. There are many possible alternatives, but they're going to have a relatively high silicic acid content. They're going to have a diuretic effect on the human being, particularly on the kidneys in terms of water relieving. And that is exactly what's happening here. A diuretic effect on the soil or on a plant is a dehydrating, drying, water relieving, which is it's relieving excess moon forces, which is bringing Saturn to bear. So equisetum is not something to just use willy-nilly when you don't need it. If you already have really dry conditions, you don't really want a diuretic effect on the plants. You would rather want something like pure silicic acid, which is the 501, because that actually helps balance transpiration so that a plant is not breathing out more water than it should. Silicic acid has been found by conventional science to help help plants during droughts, but also helps them during floods. So against lodging with their roots and against droughts. So silicic acid would be the thing to use then. It's something about the radiating, almost like pine needle effect of equisetum that has a very different process. And there's something about sulfur at work in it. If you've fermented it, it gets a very strong sulfur smell. There's something very similar to that, and horse manure, and even horse manure together with pine needles. Here on the eastern shore of Virginia, the traditional compost was made with horse manure, pine needles, and they would add lime to that as well. The result of horse manure is very interesting because of all the different manures, horse manure produces what's called sulfur-reducing bacteria. So instead of using oxygen, it's this kind of archaeobacteria, ancient bacteria that lives and breathes with sulfur. When you make equisetum arvens and that kind of sulfury smell you're getting, they're doing something similar. They're using sulfur as a breathing source, which I think is very interesting. Someone's asking about dealing with Canadian thistle in a no-till garden. Wow, okay. Do you use a broad fork, and how deep are these roots? Because this is not a particular plant I've had the pleasure to work with.
No, that answer would be no. And I'm in Michigan, so I have a lot of it coming up since I went to no-till, and
Sure.
they're really deep. You know, I use a pitchfork or a fork to get in there, and it's probably about a foot tine on it, and I still can't get to the bottom of it.
That's a really difficult one. I would, if it reproduces by rhizomes, then I would burn those and scatter those across the places where the problem is worst. I use a broad fork on all our beds, which have, I think we have a 12-inch broad fork, and then we have a 16-inch. I like to use the 16 to get as deep as possible. In addition to that, I have a 26-inch yeoman's plow, which I use to go even further. So if I needed to, I would be able to rip up something like that, which I would want to do. But if you can get air down into the soil there, a lot of these don't like that. A lot of them prefer compaction, and they prefer these kind of, when you get compaction and suffocation in the soil, anaerobic conditions, sometimes waterlogged, that's excessive moon forces. When you crack the soil and use a broad fork, or when you use a yeoman's plow or some form of deep ripper, whenever you till, you're really bringing Saturn into the soil. And that can help with a lot of these that are kind of, if you look at a weed and kind of research, where does it like to grow best? And even look at each weed and imagine you wanted to cultivate that weed as a crop. Say, how could I grow this weed in the best possible way? And then go, all right, let's eliminate all those conditions without, ruining my soil. You almost have to get to know it as well as you would any of the crops that you want to favor. Steiner said that the initiate Zarathustra, from which we get Zoroastrianism, introduced plowing, cultivation in general, but introduced plowing as a way to bring light into the soil. And that's really what we need to think about. We're bringing the light of the outer planets into the soil when we open it up. And sometimes it's not enough to kill the plants, but that totally changes the biology of the soil, totally changes what processes that at work there, and stops it from being a one-sidedly moon process to the interaction of yin and yang. If you have these and they're going to seed, because then you're going to have a real problem. If they go to seed, collect the seeds and burn those carefully, and then use that as well. In addition to that, the nice thing about a lot of these weeds is that if it's something like a thistle that has a close relationship to something like chicory or then dandelion, this may actually be something you need to use as a preparation on your own land, because it's already there, it's growing. It is in many ways a remedy in itself. If you collect that, ferment that tea, make a weed tea specifically of that, spray it back over the soil. The soil will have the experience as if all of it has already been, so to speak, thistled. And every plant is really in a succession, trying to make way ultimately to something like a forest, depending on what used to be in your area. So there's always this tendency, like where I am, this all used to be woodland. So the tendency is always moving towards a woodland. So I need to keep that in mind, that all of these weeds, all of these transition plants are moving to something else. If we can make the whole field feel like it's already experienced that plant's process, it won't want to grow there. Thistles, that's a little different because they kind of like to grow everywhere and they can form monocultures. But deep ripping as much as possible. I like the Meadow Creature Broadfork. There are cheaper ones, but the Meadow Creature Broadfork is one I've had for 10 years. I've left it outside. I've forgotten it and found it in spring. And it's fine. I've tried to break it. If anybody's going to break it, I would, and I still haven't broken either of them actually. But I really find that to be one of the best ways to bring air and light into the soil, which is really to say those outer planets, to bring the yang in to commingle with the yin, and then you have fertility that you can start to direct. So a lot of these weeds are actually a symptom of some sort of compaction. So for example, like plantain tends to have a very high copper content, so maybe don't feed to your sheep, but it's a wonderful plant, but tends to show up, at least for me, wherever I've rotated my pigs, because they muck about in the soil. They make it at least slightly anaerobic in this layer, and then I have plantain everywhere. And a lot of these are actually your remedies. So, for example, your thistle, you might collect the flowering heads before it's gone to seed and make your own version of the 506, the dandelion preparation, by using the mesentery of an animal, stuffing it with these flowers, letting that hang over summer, bury it over winter in a clay crop. And then you will have created a super concentrate of the entire living process of that herb, and then be able to distribute it at will through your compost, through your beds, without risk of encouraging the weed any further. There's a question of the frequency of peppering. Steiner talks about a process in the soil that in nature that really has a 4-year process. So Steiner's indication is really that we should be repeating the peppering for 4 consecutive years in order to oust an impulse that strayed. For example, this isn't quite weeds, but if you have like cockchafer grubs, which live off the roots of oak trees in a normal setting, if your soil has deteriorated to such a point that it is reverting to its native forest soil state, you're going to have those grubs displace and come start nibbling in your garden because they're like, oh, this feels just like my forest soil, because it's not as rich as it could be. If you look at below the leaf layer in a soil, you're often going to find poorer soil than in your garden. So basically, if Saturn has intervened too much in your garden, you're going to have these cold-blooded grubs move in and say, oh, this is really nice and warm. What you need is to bring the darkening, lightless influence to shift that over. These peppers, which for me are really a kind of alchemical salt, can be added directly to your compost, through which then they will radiate through the pile just by diffusion. It's like taking a pinch of salt and putting it in water. You don't really have to stir it. It will diffuse through the entire water. The same thing happens when you add these peppers to your compost pile. It diffuses through the entire pile. That's how the preparations work. So Terry is asking, so to recap, if we have thistle, we should make a tea of it and spray it over the garden field to help eradicate thistles? Yes. Whenever you have a weed that is doing wonderfully, for example, like I have a lot of pokeweed. Pokeweed stands tall, proud, never wilts, and no matter how hot it gets. And then you can look over at squash and say, well, the squash is wilting a little. And you take that pokeweed, you ferment it, and then you water your squash with it, and your squash then will not wilt. Because what's really happening is there's a potassium process in that pokeweed, which leads to tall, proud, standing leaves in the middle of the day. You can impart all of those qualities to your other garden plants. So I'm sure your thistle looks amazing. It's luxurious. Well, if you want your other plants to be luxurious, just say, all right, I'll take what I know grows well here, ferment that or compost that, and feed that to the other plants. And you'll start realizing, wait, this is a gigantic resource in terms of compost. And that's where, when it comes to weeding, if you must hand weed, carry a bucket and throw it into the bucket. Don't just toss it in the path. Throw it in the bucket so that actually they stay moist, so they don't dry out in the sun. Each time you add something, it shades the next layer. Then you take that, put it on your compost pile, and cover it with dirt, and then put something like an old rug over it. So it keeps all that moisture in it. What Alan Chadwick called, I think, like vital gases. You want it all to circulate and recirculate within there. But Bill Mollison, one of the founders of permaculture, liked to say that the problem is the solution. When you have these weeds that grow wonderfully, they're saying, I have everything I need. So you take them, ferment them, give them to your other plants. They similarly will have virtually everything they need. Anthony's asking, what do you think about a permanent ground cover to keep weeds out? Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Are you as a buffer or as a particular area?
So I know in permaculture, Fukuoka used like red clover as a permanent ground cover, and he would seed directly into that. Now, as I understand, they've evolved the concept more, but having basically a permanent ground cover, so you don't need to. So, like you were saying with before, the shade is constantly inhibiting the growth of the weeds.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you toyed around with it at all?
I did. In fact, yeah, I started with a lot of Fukuoka's ideas, and just, I have to say, it doesn't work for me. And I've talked to a number of people that interseeding doesn't work. I had someone come to the farm, not this year, but the last, and they wanted to do the Fukuoka thing and said, you're not going to like the results. And I've got my squash versus theirs. We have parallel rows. We treat them the exact same way. The difference is he undersows a clover. And the clover ends up just taking all the resources. It eats all of the compost. And that's the problem. These legumes actually don't really want to give their nitrogen up. They're fixing nitrogen for themselves, for them to be able to produce beans or clover seed. If you actually plant beans and allow them to go to seed, you can have a net loss of nitrogen in the soil. So people think of them as a universal gain. They're not. They're doing it for themselves. They're not. Nodules are for themselves, for their own reproduction. You have to kill the clover. You have to kill the bean before it goes to seed in order to get that nitrogen to release to neighboring plants. So I have tried undersowing, and you probably could with a very low growing crop, like there's a creeping thyme you could probably use. But I found that a lot of companion planting, it works in a sense that some plants like the same conditions. That doesn't mean they like to share, though. And if you want it to focus, for example, the bed that I planted of squash without the undercover of clover produced all year. The one with the clover produced like 3 or 4 plants. I have 3 or 4 squash each, and then kind of puttered out. So in my experience, while it makes total sense to try to have some sort of green cover around them, I would actually encourage more planting something like lettuce on both sides of another crop, so that lettuce grows quickly, shades, and then you have something to harvest. And then by the time the bigger plant has fleshed out, you've already removed all the lettuce, if that makes sense. That's at least how I approach it now. Patrick is reminding me of a question that I thought I skillfully avoided, which was, can you speak to how Saturn influences at play in climate change? Yes, I can try to talk to that. It's going to have to be relatively brief, but I will try. When it comes to this Saturn influence, what we're really having right now is not just carbon dioxide going into the air. We're actually having a real crisis of water in the air. The number one greenhouse gas is actually water vapor. We don't talk about this very much, but it's water vapor by far. Like carbon dioxide, yes, we have contributed, and I'm not doubting anthropogenic climate change, but water in the air is as much of a problem as carbon dioxide. I would say it's a bigger problem. We're having rivers in the United States that don't even make it to the ocean anymore because we're using them up. We're using them for irrigation, or we're having, like, Intel is dunking their microchips in it and evaporating that millions of gallons every day. That is changing our climate as much as the rest of this. Why is the Earth warm? Why is the moon cold? The moon, the physical moon, I mean, doesn't have an atmosphere because it needs that gaseous kind of atmosphere that obeys the laws of the fluid dynamics. Because air is a kind of fluid, if you want to think. It's a fluid that kind of goes up instead of down. It wants to seek its level by going to the ceiling. As that happens, what we're ending up with is excessive moon forces in the air. And you could also include if humus and carbon and manure are also a kind of moon force in the ground, we're ending up with carbon in the air, and we're also ending up with water in the air. but we're paving the earth. If we simply allowed plants to do their job, plants are good at holding water and they're good at cycling carbon. The two could be happening together at once. So we're ending up with this overabundance of moon forces in the air, which then are getting hotter and hotter because they're not able to release as much water. Just like the ocean warms slowly through summer and then it's warmest, at least by how we experience it, in the fall, same kind of thing is starting to happen in our air. And it's catastrophic. But one of the best things we could be doing is planting more plants and putting less in asphalt, because these plants hold water, keep it in a living form, and pull carbon out of the air. All of that together. I hope that answers. But I'm going to progress forward a little bit to a little more on the peppering. Again, I kind of consider a last resort, but let's dive into it. If it is difficult to obtain seeds, this is Steiner again, then you really don't have a weed problem. If it grows but doesn't reproduce, then it cancels itself out at the end, which gets back to what I was saying about the weeds that you must pull up by hand and sort through to get the rhizomes. Those are the ones that are the problems. But the part you're pulling up is the problem, and that is the solution. That's the part you need to burn. And that's where we're moving with this. And it's this idea, Steiner calls it a pepper in passing, which is really, I think it's really misled the biodynamic movement into thinking of it as a pepper. He said it a pepper just because it kind of looks like that, because there's probably gray and flecks of black, a little bit of white. But in terms of alchemy, there's a term called calcination, or to calcine, and that comes from the word chalk, which is to make lime. So to calcinate something is to make it white, which is to make it lime. So we're really reducing something to its lime salt content when we burn it. Now that's really important. When Steiner says we take a pest, we put it through fire, it turns into its opposite. Or a better way to say it might really be is that you take something that's in a living form, something is dissolved in an etheric body, and you burn it. So all you're left with is the physical, which is, in its sense, an opposite of the living etheric body. You're left with the pure mineral corpse of salt. If you give this salt back to the pest in question, or the plant in question, imagine it's like being dehydrated. You're out all day, you don't drink enough, or you feel parched, you get a headache, you get fatigue. If it goes long enough, you pass out. And you certainly don't feel like reproducing when this happens. When you give these salts back to the pest, they get a headache, they feel lethargic, and they don't really feel in the mood. So reproduction levels go down, the pests themselves become more sluggish, and that reproductive process is impeded. When plants fed this salt, this pepper, when they're fed this salt or pepper, they become unpalatable to the pest in question. So let's say you burn slugs and you use that as a specific thing that you feed to your garlic. The garlic becomes unpalatable. I mean, it's like how the smell of burnt human hair just sticks in your nose and you can't get it out. You're doing the same thing to these guys. And they don't like it, with good cause. But what it specifically does is it dehydrates their etheric body and makes them feel creaky and grumpy and antisocial, so therefore they don't want to reproduce. But that's what's happening when you use these peppers. When you feed it to a plant, you can make that plant unpalatable to that specific pest. It doesn't mean that it's unpalatable to all pests. It's to specific pests. Likewise, if you sow a soil with the pepper or salt that you made from the pepper, it becomes an inhospitable environment for that specific weed. But again, it is species specific. There may be a little bit of overlap when you get to like the wild radish and domesticated radish, but Steiner's indications seem to be that each organism really is so unique. And for me, it's that every organism is a unique accumulator of specific substances, and they excrete some that they find to be toxic. When you collect basically what for them is toxic and spread it back, they don't want to be there. The same thing would be true if someone asked about gophers or chipmunks or moles or voles. Collect their soil from their tunnels, because that soil is full of what their kidneys are always excreting, the salts that they find to be toxic to them, what they need to remove as an excess. By collecting that and moving that to your garden, if nothing else, your garden starts to smell to the vole as a vole public urinal. All right, doesn't smell great, so it doesn't want to be there. But to you, it's completely harmless and you don't notice. And that's why you use these peppers. So you can collect the urine of an animal. It becomes inhospitable eventually to that animal, which is part of the reason for me we shouldn't use, at least in concentration, human urine on the garden. Something like the urine from a cow, totally different process, totally healthy to use on the garden. Human, I'm not a big fan of using, particularly in concentration, anywhere near our food crops. There's a farmer near me who I warned, I'm like, hey, I don't think you should be using that, because your kidneys are already extracting and excreting salts that your body feels are in excess. And he lived off his garden. If you put them back there, you've now compounded that excess. So then your kidneys are going to have to work twice as hard. And then you add it back. Now they're working 3 times as hard. Within 6 months, he was in the hospital with kidney failure and nearly died. He stopped doing the urine thing, but he never admitted that that's what it was. And I'm pretty sure that's what it was. So there's a question from Anthony. In the demonstration I've seen of peppering, it seems like there's far more wood ash than the pest. Is this the best method, or does concentration of the pest ash versus fuel not matter? I would not mix the two together. You should get a small box or some sort of container, almost a crucible, where you put the plant material in and you burn the fire from underneath. It doesn't matter if the material in your container catches fire, as long as you're keeping the ashes separate, because the ones you're really targeting are the salts left behind of that pepper. You could mix it in with the wood, and that's not going to, necessarily cause any harm, but it might not either give you any of the benefits that you wanted, if that makes sense. Yeah, like they're bringing something like wood ash is a very strong alkaline lime-like process. And you could spread that there. That'll definitely cancel out any moon forces there. It's so alkaline. It's not going to allow it. You could turn your whole farm into a moonscape if you spread too much wood ash. It's fine to use on doses. I would be sparing in terms of how much you use. Terry's asking, are there any books or resources on this topic that you can recommend? Which in particular? Is it on the peppers? On peppering, you might look at some of Maria Toon's research. Lily Kalisko has some interesting stuff on that. And then there's odds and ends through all sorts of different biodynamic books, but I don't know that there is a champion book that I would recommend. Maybe someone needs to write it, but I don't know of one existing yet, actually. There probably is, but one's not coming to mind that really, really stood out. There are ones about weeds, not quite the weed peppering part. All right. So now we've come almost to our end. So I will ask people to chime in here, please. And let's talk about some more weed stuff. Feel free to unmute yourself. I can field questions.
Yeah,
Hi.
yeah. This is Jason from India. Like when you're preparing the peppers, is it needed to do any potentization like before it is utilized, or just mixing with water and sprinkling it?
It's a good question. different practitioners have found that certain homeopathic dilutions of the substance work adequately enough where you're able to distribute it out. I don't personally have a lot of experience with homeopathy other than making specific dilutions for my own uses, but you can apply it full strength. The problem with full strength, particularly if you're able to calcinate it to a point where it turns white, you don't want to touch the stuff. Don't get it on your eyes. Try not to touch your hands, because you really kind of made a quicklime version of that pest. It won't be pleasant if you touch it. It could cause blisters. So don't handle it. You shouldn't handle fresh wood ash anyway without something like a mask. But in terms of potentizing it, I think you can. And again, I think Maria Toon has specific dilutions that she found worked best. Offhand, I can't remember which. For some reason, I think it was D20. That's just what's coming to mind. Don't hold me to that, but that's what's coming to my mind.
Sorry. Is there any is there any ratio of mixing this calcinated material with water? Any ratios you suggest?
It's one of those things where Steiner talks about, in terms of getting it across the land, it's more, you need very little. And the problem with finding out how much a particular farm needs is you'd almost have to test it, because every plot is different. The climate above that plot that made the plot and the soil that way is different. And you'd really have to test it, because with a lot of these things, there's no one size fits all metric. I wish there were, but I'm really suspicious when anybody gives a one size fits all ratio. And so I don't remember them because I don't believe them. So sorry, I hope that answers it though. Let's see. Linda is asking, do you make peppers using specific calendar times? This is where Steiner talks about there are two sides of the year. One that's culminating in potency for insect pests, and another that's culminating in terms of like seeds. And then he shows a part where he says Venus behind Scorpio, the Venus behind the sun in Scorpio, excuse me. Can you hear me now? Hold on, let me switch this. How about now? Better? Okay. Steiner recommends for pest peppers that are mammals when Venus is behind the sun in Scorpio. And that was really confusing to me for a long time. And some people take that quite literally, that it's behind the sun physically or behind the sun as the evening star. But at a certain point, it kind of clicked to me is that Venus in Scorpio has this esoteric meaning that, if you were to take it in terms of the tarot, means debauch, which has to be, there's too much, it's excess, it's very sexually potent. Venus in Scorpio. And for me, I've come to realize that I think that's shorthand for the mating season of any given pest. And I think that's true of all of us. Again, you want viable seeds, you want viable roots. Why wouldn't you then also want sexually viable mammals, particularly during their mating season? Or the pests, you want the pests during their mating season, which Steiner says tends to be, I think, towards Taurus, which in his season you have to calculate when that is, but that may be when they're getting up and running and laying their eggs. So mating pairs of pests, I think, would really be ideal. Viable seeds, and I even think the seeds, so to speak, the eggs of pests would also count, if that makes sense. So for me, I don't necessarily literally wait for Venus to be in Scorpio, because it doesn't happen very often. But when you have a pest and they're proliferating and they're mating, that's the time to catch them. And if you can't burn them right then and you'd like to wait, store them in a distilled vinegar or distilled alcohol, and then just strain them, and that alcohol will just light up when you want to burn them, and you can burn them at the ideal time that way. So you could save them from their mating season and then burn them literally according to the astrological conditions. But a lot of these things, like Saturn, when Saturn means warm air, that made me start going, wait, maybe some of these others like Venus and Scorpio is actually code for their mating season. And so that's how I look to that. If I hope that makes sense. So I don't try to be too dogmatic about that part, because we can get hung up on some of those details when it may prevent us from using some of the most effective remedies if we take some of this too literally. And I don't mean that there wouldn't also be benefit doing it according to the stars. I'm not negating that. I think there's also, what is Venus in Scorpio within the Earth realm? And that's a separate thing. Just like warm air is Saturn within the Earth realm. We have to take all of this into consideration. But again, sexually viable, that's important. When it comes to insects that don't have a central nervous system, but instead have a nerve cord, a central nerve cord. This is a term that's not properly translated from the agriculture course that I caught when I did up my new translation. And it makes total sense. You burn the entire animal then when it's that. Whereas if it has a central nervous system, you only burn the skin, if that makes sense. So Patrick's asking, what is the best way to address spider grass? It's very invasive and persistent as bamboo. The same thing. Dig up the part that reproduces. And I don't know how much you'd have to dig up, but as you know, if you cut it, that just feeds it. So that's not really what you're after. So you'd have to do something similar. Yeah, it would have to be a very similar process. I'm trying now on our farm, because we have bamboo, is digging up the rhizomes, calcinating that, and spreading or incorporating that in a protective layer around them. And I may have to keep doing that. You may have to do it as long as you want to protect it, but I think that is how I would approach that. Any other questions? Please.
Yeah. In contrary, sometime like this, the forest fires, like we have in India sometime, the forest fires, but that it's once again like naturally it's burning the entire plant and leaving them there. But once again, the same weeds or the plants are growing. How to understand that?
Yes, Steiner's actually, someone asked Steiner something similar about when people burn entire fields of potatoes when they're done. And they ask, would this not have the same kind of detrimental effect? And he says no, because you haven't targeted the reproductive part of the plant. So when they burn fields, they're not burning the potato seed or the potato eye. They're burning the leafy part, which is not reproducing. So when you have a forest fire, it is conceivable that you could burn it in such a time that you would also be burning all of the seeds. And that would then have that inhibiting effect, but it would have to be the reproductive part. So if you burn a tree, that's not burning the reproductive part. When you burn everything above the ground and the rhizomes are still intact, or some of them are, they can return. It's that particular window of the forces of reproduction that must pass through fire. And in that sense, when a forest burns, yes, there's going to be some seeds that are burning, and those will have an inhibiting effect wherever they have burned and their ashes have fallen. But beyond that, an entire forest could burn and a whole new one could come up, but maybe maple doesn't want to grow in this part. Maybe a pine tree doesn't want to grow here, so they switch places. So the inhibiting effect is very localized to where the ashes fell. I hope that answers.
Thank you very much.
Linda's asking about drying the rhizomes before burning. You could, yeah, that wouldn't hurt. Though if you have a fire that you can keep going long enough, they'll dry out on their own there as well. So they might dry a little. If you put them in the sun a little bit beforehand, just so they lose like half of their moisture, the burning process will go much faster. Again, also, if you preserve them in high-proof alcohol, anything more than 50%, that will also help facilitate the burn, because the alcohol will burn as well. All right. I think that pretty much wraps up our talk for today, and I appreciate everyone coming out. This was actually a lot of fun.
Oh, it's a good, thanks a lot for your sharing your good knowledge, and really, it's a good webinar to attend, and I'm happy about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for joining us tonight. Tomorrow I'll be sending out a video recording and a link, as well as a quick survey, so you can hear more about your experience in our session. Just want to share that Stewart's Microdynamics series will continue monthly until October, so please have a look on our website for those sessions that are being offered. Our next one will be August 13th, and will be focused on building better compost. So thank you, Stewart, for this evening, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Bye now.
Sure. Bye, everybody.